The silk is too coarse, the Alpha King murmured, his voice a low, dark rumble that vibrated through the frosted marble of the great hall. Sarah, her hands trembling, smoothed the shimmering ivory fabric across the mahogany table. It is the finest in the realm, Your Majesty. Fit for your Luna. Preston stepped closer, the immense heat of his towering frame suffocating the bitter winter chill. He didn't look at the fabric. His gold-flecked eyes were entirely consumed by her flushed face. Then why do you look at it with such sorrow, little Omega? If you were the one standing at the altar, what would you wear? She swallowed hard, unaware she was already planning her own binding. The northern fortress of Blackwood Keep was a place carved from unforgiving granite and ancient ice. It sat atop the craggy spine of the world, a monument to the brutal strength of the wolves who called it home. Within its high, vaulted walls, the air was always thick with the scent of pine needles, wood smoke, and the overwhelming metallic tang of alpha power. For Sarah, a low-born Omega, navigating the endless stone corridors was an exercise in silence and invisibility. Omegas were the gentle heart of the pack, caretakers and peacekeepers. But in the court of King Preston, they were meant to be shadows against the firelight, until the decree had echoed through the courtyards. The Alpha King was to take a mate. The impending ceremony had thrown the keep into a subdued, anxious frenzy. But the true shock had come when the king's terrifyingly stoic beta had handed Sarah a leather-bound ledger and a ring of iron keys, informing her that the king himself had requested her to oversee the preparations. She possesses a quiet eye for detail, the king had supposedly said. Let the Omega design the binding. Now, Sarah stood alone in the center of the cavernous great hall, dwarfed by the massive arched windows that looked out over a relentless swirling snowstorm. The long oak tables were buried beneath avalanches of fabric swatches, floral catalogs brought from the southern territories, and heavy tomes detailing centuries of lichen mating rites. Her slender fingers brushed against a spool of crimson velvet. It was rich, the color of fresh blood on snow traditional for a royal binding. Yet, as she stared at it, a hollow ache bloomed in her chest. She did not know who the Luna was. The king had kept her identity an absolute secret, a closely guarded mystery that sent whispers racing through the sculleries and training yards. Sarah tried to envision a high-born alpha female, fierce and unyielding, draped in this heavy crimson. It felt wrong. It felt like a cage. The atmospheric pressure in the room abruptly shifted. It was a physical sensation, a sudden heaviness in the air that made the fine hairs on the back of Sarah's neck stand on end. The ambient chatter of the wind against the glass seemed to mute. Before she even heard the heavy, measured footfalls against the stone floor, her Omega instincts flared, demanding she lower her gaze, bare the soft column of her throat, and submit. Preston. He moved like a shadow detached from the night. Silent despite his massive, broad-shouldered frame, he wore dark, tailored leathers that absorbed the meager gray light of the storm, a thick fur mantle resting over his shoulders. His scent petrichor, crushed cedar, and the ozone crackle of a lightning strike washed over her, stealing the breath directly from her lungs. Sarah immediately dropped into a deep curtsy, her eyes fixed on the scuffed toes of his dark boots. Your Majesty. Rise, Sarah, he commanded. His voice was a physical weight, a gravelly baritone that seemed to vibrate through the soles of her feet. She straightened, though she kept her eyes averted, fixing her gaze on the center of his chest. He was too close. The space between them, usually dictated by the strict hierarchy of the pack, had evaporated. She could feel the furnace-like heat radiating from his skin, a stark contrast to the drafty chill of the hall. Preston reached past her, his knuckles brushing against the sleeve of her wool dress. A jolt of electricity snapped against her skin at the fleeting contact, sharp enough to make her gasp. If he noticed, he gave no sign. His large, scarred hand picked up the crimson velvet she read, he noted, the syllable rolling slowly off his tongue. The council's preference, I assume. It is. Tradition, my king, Sarah managed to whisper, her pulse fluttering wildly at the base of her throat. The color of strength, of bloodlines. For your Luna, Preston dropped the velvet. It fell to the table with a heavy, lifeless thud. I have no interest in the council's dusty traditions, or in bloodlines. He turned his head, and though she was not looking into his eyes, She could feel the burning intensity of his gaze tracing the profile of her face. "I asked you to design this, Sarah, not the elders. I must ensure it is perfect for her, Alpha," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. "If I only knew her temperament, if she favors the bold colors of the autumn packs, or the stark whites of the north." "Forget the north. Forget the packs," Preston interrupted softly. He stepped half a pace closer, entirely invading her personal space. His shadow swallowed her small frame. "Tell me what you see when you close your eyes, Omega." Sarah's breath hitched. She dared to lift her chin, her soft hazel eyes finally meeting his piercing, gold-flecked stare. The sheer dominance in his gaze was intoxicating, rooting her to the spot. "TD, I see midnight blue," she breathed, the truth slipping past her defenses before she could stop it. "Like the sky just before the stars break through. I see silver thread, like moonlight on water, not heavy velvet. Silk, something that moves with the wind, not against it." Preston's eyes darkened, the gold rings around his pupils expanding. The muscle in his jaw feathered as he stared down at her, the silence stretching between them, thick and taut as a drawn bowstring. Slowly, deliberately, he reached out and picked up a length of delicate, silver-spun ribbon from the table. Without breaking eye contact, he wrapped the ribbon gently around Sarah's slender wrist, his rough, calloused thumbs dragging against the fragile skin of her inner pulse point. The heat of his touch sent a molten rush of warmth straight to her core. Her breath shuddered out of her in a white cloud against the chill air. "Midnight blue and silver," Preston murmured, his voice dropping an octave, sounding perilously close to a growl. He stepped back, the loss of his body heat leaving her instantly shivering. "Order it. See that it is done exactly as you envision." Before Sarah could formulate a response, the king turned and strode out of the hall, leaving her standing alone, her wrist still bound in silver, her heart hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm against her ribs. Midnight had long since fallen over Blackwood Keep, cloaking the fortress in absolute darkness save for the flickering torches that lined the main corridors. The storm outside had intensified, the wind shrieking like wounded beasts against the thick stone walls. Deep in the belly of the keep, within the cavernous royal archives, Sarah sat cross-legged on a faded Persian rug before a roaring hearth. The library was a sanctuary of ancient scents, crumbling parchment, dried leather, and beeswax candles. Towering shelves of history stretched upward into the shadows, guarding the secrets of the lichen ancestors. Sarah rubbed her tired eyes, a smudge of black ink staining the side of her palm. Her lap was buried beneath heavy, leather-bound tomes. She was searching for the ancient mating vows. The modern court used a sanitized political translation, but Preston's dismissal of tradition in the Great Hall had driven her here. If he wanted something real, something forged from the heart rather than the council's dictates, she would find the original words. She traced her finger down a page of brittle, yellowed vellum, her lips moving silently as she translated the old runic script. "I offer the warmth of my blood to your winter. I offer the shadow of my form to your blinding light. Flesh to flesh, soul to soul, until the earth reclaims our bones." A deep blush crept up her neck, warming her cheeks. The old words were entirely visceral. They spoke of total surrender, of a bond that went beyond titles and politics. It was raw, possessive, and intimately feral. To imagine the stoic, terrifying King Preston speaking these words to a woman, a soft sound at the edge of the firelight made her freeze. She turned, her heart leaping into her throat. Preston stood in the archway of the archives. He had discarded his heavy furs and leathers. He wore only a simple black tunic, the laces at the collar undone, revealing the thick cords of his neck and the light dusting of dark hair on his chest. He looked unrested, his golden eyes glowing faintly in the dim light, the shadows beneath them speaking of sleepless nights. "You should be resting, Omega," he said, his voice a quiet rasp that blended with the crackle of the hearth. "I could not sleep, Your Majesty," Sarah replied, scrambling to gather the heavy books from her lap to stand and bow. "Do not rise," he commanded gently. He walked into the circle of firelight, his barefoot steps making no sound on the ancient stones. To her immense shock, the Alpha King did not take the ornate high-backed chair near the fire. Instead, he lowered his massive frame directly onto the rug, folding his long legs to sit just an arm's length away from her. The proximity was dizzying, His natural scent completely overpowered the smell of old paper, wrapping around her in a suffocatingly pleasant blanket of pine and rain. "What keeps you awake, Sarah?" he asked, leaning his forearms on his knees, his gaze dropping to the open book in her lap. "The vows," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the snapping flames. "I wanted to find the old words, the ones spoken before the keep was built, when the pack ran wild in the valleys." Preston's eyes snapped up to hers, a flash of something dangerously possessive sparking in the gold depths. "Read them to me." Sarah hesitated, her throat suddenly dry. She looked down at the runic text, the letters swimming slightly before her eyes. She took a trembling breath and began to read, her soft melodic voice filling the quiet space. "My heart is the drum. Your breath is the rhythm," she read, the emotional subtext of the ancient words wrapping around her own secret, forbidden desires. "I bare my throat to your fangs, not in defeat, but in trust. You are the shelter in the storm. You are the fire in the frost." She stopped, unable to read the final line. The heat in the room felt unbearable. "Finish it," Preston murmured. He had leaned closer. She could feel the warmth of his breath against the shell of her ear. "I claim you," she whispered, her voice breaking, "not as possession, but as my own soul, walking outside my body." Silence fell over them, heavier than the stone ceiling above. The fire popped, sending a shower of orange sparks up the chimney. Sarah kept her eyes glued to the page, terrified that if she looked at him, he would see the desperate, aching longing written across her face. Slowly, Preston lifted his hand. He didn't touch her neck, nor did he demand her submission. Instead, the rough pad of his thumb brushed against her cheekbone, wiping away the smudge of dark ink she hadn't known was there. The touch was agonizingly tender, a stark contrast to the lethal strength contained within his hands. "They are beautiful words," Preston said softly, his thumb lingering for a fraction of a second against the soft skin near her jaw before pulling away. "But words are meaningless if the environment does not match them. What of the flowers? The council demands blood rose." Sarah swallowed, trying to ground herself, trying to remember her place. "Blood roses are beautiful, but they wilt in the cold," she managed to say, her voice shaky. If it were my choice, I would use frost lilies. They only bloom in the deepest snow. They require the harshness of winter to reveal their beauty. They represent endurance, survival." Preston stared at the fire, the orange light carving sharp, devastating angles into his jawline. "Frost lilies," he repeated. "They only grow in the whispering woods, beyond the safety of the perimeter." "I know," Sarah said quietly, "but they would make the hall look like a dream." Preston turned his head, his golden eyes locking onto hers with a gravitational pull she could not fight. The air between them was so charged, so thick with unspoken emotion, that Sarah felt lightheaded. She desperately needed to break the tension before she did something foolish, like lean into his touch. "Your Majesty," she breathed, her hands twisting in the fabric of her skirt. "Please, who is she?" "If I knew who the Luna was, I could ensure everything is exactly as she desires." Preston leaned in closer, until his face was mere inches from hers. The scent of him was intoxicating, drugging her senses. "She is someone," he whispered, his gaze dropping to her trembling lips, "who does not yet know her own worth." He stood then, in one fluid, powerful motion, leaving Sarah sitting by the fire, her entire body trembling as if she had just survived a freefall from the highest tower of the keep. The morning sky was a bruised, oppressive purple when Sarah slipped out through the postern gate of Blackwood Keep. She wore her thickest woolen cloak, lined with rabbit fur, and carried a small woven basket over her arm. The interaction with Preston the night before had left her restless, her skin buzzing with phantom touches and impossible thoughts. She needed to clear her head. She needed to be useful. She needed the frost lilies. The whispering woods lay just a mile past the main stone bridge, a dense, ancient forest of towering black pines that seemed to scrape the underbelly of the storm clouds. The snow was knee-deep, pulling at her boots with every step, turning the trek into an exhausting ordeal. Her lungs burned with the icy air, but the physical exertion was a welcome distraction from the chaotic whirlwind of her mind. "She does not yet know her own worth." His words echoed in her ears, timing themselves to the crunch of her boots in the snow. Who could he mean? A highborn lady kept in isolation? A ward of another alpha? It didn't matter. She reminded herself harshly. Her job was to serve the king, to prepare his binding, and then to fade back into the shadows of the scullery where she belonged. After an hour of plunging through the dense tree line, the air grew incredibly still. The wind ceased its howling, leaving a silence so absolute it made her ears ring. Ahead, nestled beneath the massive, gnarled roots of an ancient willow tree beside a frozen stream, she saw them. Frost lilies. They were breathtaking. Their petals were translucent, glowing with a faint, iridescent blue light against the stark white snow, their stems delicate as spun glass. Sarah dropped to her knees, pulling off her heavy leather mittens to carefully snap the stems. Her fingers quickly grew numb, turning a raw, angry red in the biting cold. But she filled her basket with reverent care. She had just placed the last bloom into the woven reeds when the atmosphere shattered. It didn't begin as a breeze, but as a violent, physical blow. A sudden whiteout blizzard descended upon the woods with the ferocity of a hunting predator. In seconds, the bruised purple sky was erased by a blinding wall of chaotic, swirling white. Sarah scrambled to her feet, clutching the basket to her chest, but the wind immediately knocked her sideways. She hit the ground hard, the breath driven from her lungs. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her veins. She couldn't see the trees. She couldn't see the path she had carved in the snow. The temperature plummeted so rapidly she could feel the moisture freezing on her eyelashes. "No," she gasped, forcing herself up, leaning entirely into the gale. She took 3 steps before she realized she had no idea which direction the keep lay. The whispering woods were vast, a labyrinth of identical black trunks. To wander blindly in a whiteout was a death sentence. Her omega instinct screamed at her to find shelter, to hide, to burrow. Dragging her freezing limbs, she managed to crawl back toward the massive roots of the ancient willow. There was a hollow beneath the trunk, barely large enough for a fox, let alone a woman. She forced herself inside, curling into a tight, shivering ball, wrapping her thick cloak as tightly around herself as her numb fingers would allow. The cold was not just a temperature. It was an entity. It sank its teeth into her bones, slowing her racing heart, heavying her eyelids. The roaring of the wind began to sound distant, muffled like it was underwater. She looked at the basket of frost lilies, their blue light fading as the snow began to bury them. "I am going to die here," she thought, a strange, detached calm settling over her. "The king will not have his flowers." Then, she heard it, a low, resonant sound that vibrated not in the air, but through the frozen earth beneath her. A growl so deep, so purely alpha, that it sparked a primal waking terror in her fading mind. Through the blinding wall of white, a shadow emerged. It was massive, the size of a warhorse, covered in thick, pitch-black fur that seemed to absorb the snow. Golden eyes, burning like miniature suns, locked onto her hiding spot beneath the roots. The wolf did not walk. It stalked toward her, effortlessly parting the waste, deep snow. The sheer, suffocating aura of dominance hit Sarah a second before the beast did. It was Preston. His wolf form was legendary, a monster of myth whispered about to frighten pups into obedience. But seeing it, feeling the earth-shaking power of it, was entirely different. The great black wolf thrust its massive head under the roots. He let out a sharp, distressed whine, a sound so out of place for his size that it jolted Sarah fully awake. Before she could speak, the wolf pulled back into the storm. A silhouette of a man shifted in the blinding snow, too fast for her eyes to track. Seconds later, heavy arms wrapped in black fur reached into the hollow. Preston pulled her out of the earth. He was in his human form, wearing only his trousers and the massive fur cloak he had thrown over his shoulders. He didn't speak. His jaw was clenched so tightly a muscle ticked violently beneath his skin. He wrapped his enormous cloak entirely around her, lifting her against his bare, burning chest as easily as if she weighed nothing at all. "Preston," she mumbled, her lips blue, the title of king forgotten in the haze of hypothermia. A terrifying, rumbling growl vibrated through his chest against her cheek. He held her impossibly tight, crushing her against his heat. The storm raged around them, the wind tearing at his hair. But inside the cocoon of his arms and his cloak, Sarah felt a sudden, profound spike of warmth. It wasn't just body heat. It was a spark, a flare of golden energy that leaped from his skin into hers, rushing through her freezing veins and reigniting her dying heart. The mate bond, desperate and terrified, was fighting to keep her alive. Preston carried her through the blinding whiteout, his steps relentless, defying the wrath of the winter. Sarah buried her face in the crook of his neck, breathing in the scent of cedar, lightning, and the sharp metallic tang of his fear. By the time the heavy wooden doors of the keep slammed shut behind them, Sarah was drifting on the edge of consciousness. She heard the frantic shouts of the guards, the rush of footsteps. "Fetch the healers," a voice bellowed. "No," Preston's voice roared, a sound that made the very stones of the fortress tremble. "Everyone out. Out!" She felt herself being carried up spiral staircases, deep into the heart of the Alpha's private wing. She was laid gently onto a massive bed, the mattress sinking beneath her. The roar of a freshly stoked fire quickly filled the room. Preston's hands were everywhere, stripping away her sodden, freezing cloak, peeling off her wet boots. He wrapped her in thick, heated furs from his own bed, climbing onto the mattress beside her to pull her back against his chest, sharing his core heat. "You foolish, beautiful creature." He breathed into her wet hair, his voice rough with an emotion she had never heard from the stoic king. "You could have died." Sarah couldn't speak. She was too exhausted, the warmth making her incredibly heavy. But as she closed her eyes, letting the steady, powerful thumping of his heart lull her to sleep, her heightened omega senses picked up on something that made her breath catch. The heavy furs wrapped around her smelled entirely of the Alpha King. But beneath the cedar and storm, another scent was rising. It was sweet, like rain on fresh earth, and it was entirely intertwined with his. It was her own scent, mingled, claimed, bound. Consciousness returned to Sarah in slow, lethargic waves, pulling her up from a vast ocean of heat. She did not wake with the usual jolt of a servant anticipating the harsh, unforgiving clang of the morning bell. Instead, she surfaced into an atmosphere of absolute, hushed security. She inhaled deeply, the air rich with the masculine scent of crushed cedar and ozone. Her eyes fluttered open to a ceiling painted with faded gold frescoes, the ancient depictions of the first Lycan wars. She was not in the drafty, stone-walled scullery. She was swallowed by a mattress large enough to sleep 5, buried beneath a mountain of black wolf pelt furs that smelled so intensely of the Alpha King it made her pulse thrum against her wrists. Panic, sharp and cold, finally pierced the haze. She bolted upright, clutching the thick furs to her chest. "Careful." The voice came from the shadows near the immense, arched window. Preston stood there, leaning against the frozen glass, looking out over the snow-buried courtyards of the keep. He had dressed, though casually, dark trousers and a loose linen shirt that stretched taut across his broad shoulders. He turned toward her, the ambient morning light catching the severe, breathtaking architecture of his face. The golden rings in his eyes were blown wide, tracking her every micro-movement. "Your Majesty," Sarah gasped, her voice raspy from the cold she had barely escaped. She moved to throw off the furs, intending to scramble to her feet and kneel. I should not be here. The servants' quarters. You will stay exactly where you are," Preston ordered. It wasn't a roar, but the absolute finality in his tone brooked no argument. He crossed the expansive room in a few long strides, picking up a heavy iron goblet from a side table and offering it to her. "Drink. It is a broth of willow bark and bloodroot. The healers say your core temperature dropped too dangerously." Sarah took the goblet with trembling hands, hyper-aware that their fingers brushed in the exchange. She drank, the hot liquid burning a pleasant trail down her throat, easing the ache in her chest. As she lowered the goblet, she noticed something resting on the dark mahogany nightstand beside the bed. A crystal bowl, filled with fresh snow, and nestled perfectly within it were the glowing, translucent blue petals of the frost lilies. Her breath hitched. "You saved them." Preston's jaw flexed. He sat on the absolute edge of the mattress, the springs groaning in protest under his immense weight. "You nearly traded your life for a handful of flowers, Sarah. Did you truly believe I would leave them to freeze?" "They were for the ceremony," she whispered, unable to meet his eyes. "For your Luna." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the room. The fire crackled in the hearth, throwing dancing shadows against the walls. Preston reached out, his hand hovering over the furs covering her knee before he curled his fingers into a loose fist and pulled away. The keep is filling, he said quietly, changing the subject with a noticeable rigidness. The southern delegations arrived at dawn. The council elders are assembling in the lower halls to prepare for the rehearsal feast. Sarah's heart plummeted. The Luna. She must be arriving with the southern delegations. Then I must return to my duties, she said, her voice sounding small, even to her own ears. There is so much left to arrange. The tapestries, the seating. You will arrange nothing from the scullery, Preston countered, his golden gaze pinning her to the pillows. You will work from the solar attached to these chambers, until you I mek, but the elders. I am the king, he growled softly, leaning forward, the raw dominance in his aura washing over her in a tidal wave. Not the elders. You will stay where I know you are safe, where I can smell that you are safe. The confession hung in the air between them, fragile and terrifying. Sarah realized then, with a sharp intake of breath, that the scent filling the room was no longer just his. The sweetness of rain on fresh earth, her scent had woven seamlessly into the cedar and ozone, saturating the furs, the pillows, the very air of the Alpha's inner sanctum. Any wolf who stepped into this corridor would know a female had slept in the king's bed. Before Sarah could ask him what it meant, what they were doing, a sharp, heavy knock echoed from the heavy oak door. Alpha, the stoic voice of Kael, the beta, filtered through the thick wood. The council demands an audience. The High Elder has brought forth Lady Vespera. Preston closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, a look of profound, violent exhaustion passing over his features. When he opened them, the king had returned. He stood up, turning his back to her. Rest, Omega, he said, not looking back as he strode toward the door. Your king commands it. For 3 days, Sarah was a prisoner in a velvet cage. True to his word, Preston had confined her to the solar adjoining his private chambers. It was a beautiful, sunlit room overlooking the eastern mountains, filled with plush reading chairs and a massive desk covered in the ledgers and catalogs she needed to plan the ceremony. Food was brought to her by Kael, the beta, who offered no gossip, only silent nods and a watchful, protective gaze that made Sarah realize he was under strict orders. The isolation was maddening, but it was nothing compared to the agony of her own imagination. From the high windows, she could hear the courtyards bustling with the arrival of visiting packs. The muffled sounds of lyres, laughter, and howling echoed up the stone walls. They were celebrating the impending union. They were celebrating Lady Vespera. Sarah stood before a large, gilded mirror in the corner of the solar. On a dressmaker's mannequin beside her hung the culmination of her work. A breathtaking gown of midnight blue silk, intricately embroidered with silver thread that cascaded down the bodice like starlight. It was exactly as she had envisioned it that day in the Great Hall. It was weightless, fluid, and fiercely independent. It was meant for a queen. It was meant for a stranger. She reached out, her fingers brushing the cool, liquid silk. The ribbon Preston had tied around her wrist days ago was still there, frayed at the edges but securely knotted. A painful, pathetic lump formed in her throat. She was a fool. She had let the intoxicating attention of an Alpha King make her forget her bloodline. He had saved her because it was an Alpha's duty to protect his pack. He had shared his bed's warmth out of medicinal necessity. Nothing more. The heavy door connecting the solar to Preston's bedchamber clicked open. Sarah immediately dropped her hand from the silk, turning to face the intruder. Preston stood in the doorway, wearing the formal, high-collared tunic of his station, a silver chain of state resting heavy across his broad chest. He looked magnificent, regal, and entirely untouchable. Yet, as he stepped into the solar and closed the door behind him, the stiff posture of the king melted away. He looked at her, his golden eyes instantly softening, dropping to the pulse fluttering frantically at the base of her throat. You are crying, he noted, his voice a low rumble that vibrated against the glass of the windows. Sarah hastily brought a hand to her cheek, shocked to find it wet. She wiped the rogue tear away, dropping into a quick curtsy. I am just tired, Your Majesty. The final details. Preston didn't listen. He crossed the room, his long strides eating up the distance until he was standing directly in front of her. He didn't look at the magnificent silk gown on the mannequin. He looked only at her reflection in the gilded mirror, stepping behind her so that his massive frame entirely enveloped hers in the glass. Tell me, he murmured, his deep voice right beside her ear, sending a shiver of pure electricity down her spine. "Does the dress displease you?" "No," she whispered, staring at their reflection. He was a creature of shadow and power. She was small, pale, and trembling. "It is perfect. Lady Vesper will look beautiful in it." Preston's hands lifted. For a second, Sarah thought he was going to touch the dress, but his large palms settled gently on her shoulders. The heat of him seeped through the thin wool of her plain gray dress. "The council chose Lady Vespera," Preston said, his voice tightening, his thumbs tracing slow, deliberate circles against her collarbones. "They paraded her into my hall, citing her pedigree, her pack's military strength, her pure bloodline." Sarah closed her eyes, unable to look at the mirror anymore. The pain in her chest was a physical tearing sensation. "She will make a strong Luna. She would make a tyrant," Preston corrected, his voice dropping to a harsh, feral whisper. He leaned in closer, his chest brushing flush against her back. The mate bond, undeniably powerful now, flared to life, filling the air with the overwhelming scent of a looming storm. "I asked you to design the binding, Sarah. Do you know why? Because of my eye for detail," she recited, quoting his decree, her breath hitching as his nose brushed against the shell of her ear. "No," he growled softly, inhaling the scent of her neck like a starving man. "Because I needed to see what you wanted. I needed to see if the Omega who hides in the shadows had the heart of a Luna." Sarah's eyes snapped open, locking onto his burning golden gaze in the mirror. Her heart stopped. The world stopped. "Preston." She breathed, using his name without permission, completely unmoored. Before he could answer, the sharp, frantic ringing of the courtyard bells shattered the quiet intimacy of the solar. It was the signal. The rehearsal feast was beginning. The king was required to take his throne. Preston closed his eyes, a muscle feathering violently in his jaw. He slowly, agonizingly pulled his hands away from her shoulders, the loss of his touch leaving her cold. "Bring the silk down to the great hall," he commanded, his voice returning to the stoic, impenetrable tone of the Alpha King. The hour has come. The great hall was unrecognizable. The austere stone walls had been transformed by thousands of glowing candles. The harsh winter held at bay by roaring hearths and the suffocating heat of 100 gathered lichens. Highborn alphas and betas from across the territories sat at the long oak tables, their laughter loud, their scents clashing in a dizzying display of dominance and politics. Sarah stood near the archway of the kitchens, half hidden in the shadows, clutching the heavy garment bag that held the midnight blue silk. Her hands were shaking violently. At the head of the room, upon a raised dais, sat the king's throne. Preston was there, looking like a god of war carved from obsidian and gold. He was speaking to an elder, his expression completely blank, his posture rigid, and seated directly to his right, in a chair nearly as ornate as the throne itself, was Lady Vespera. She was undeniably stunning. Tall, with sleek silver hair and piercing violet eyes, she moved with the predatory grace of an alpha female who had never been told no. She wore a gown of crimson velvet, the very color Sarah had rejected, and she looked at the room with a haughty, victorious sneer. "Omega." The sharp bark of the High Elder snapped Sarah out of her trance. An old, scarred wolf with a cane limped toward her, his nose wrinkling in disgust as he caught her scent. "You linger. Bring the ceremonial garments to the ladies' chambers for the fitting. The rehearsal of the vows begins in an hour." "Yes, Elder," Sarah murmured, keeping her eyes glued to the floor. She navigated the crowded edges of the hall, feeling like a ghost. As she passed the high table, she accidentally made eye contact with Lady Vespera. The alpha female's violet eyes narrowed sharply, her nostrils flaring as she caught Sarah's scent. Vespera's gaze darted to Preston, then back to Sarah, a look of pure, venomous realization flashing across her beautiful face. Sarah rushed past, escaping up the servants' stairwell, her lungs burning. An hour later, the great hall grew deadly silent. The musicians ceased playing. The rehearsal of the vows was a sacred tradition, a public declaration of intent before the final binding under the full moon. Sarah stood by the massive stone pillars at the back of the hall, her heart a dead weight in her chest. She had done her job. She had delivered the silk. Now, she had to watch him pledge his soul to another. The heavy doors at the top of the dais opened. Lady Vespera stepped out, A collective gasp echoed through the hall. Vespera was wearing the midnight blue silk, but on her tall, rigid frame, the dress looked wrong. The delicate silver thread seemed to clash with her harsh, predatory aura. It did not flow like water. It hung awkwardly, a garment designed for a different soul entirely. Vespera looked furious. Her lips thinned into a tight line as she descended the steps toward Preston. Preston stood from his throne. The hall held its breath. Vespera approached him, extending a hand to initiate the traditional clasp of the rehearsal. "My king," she purred, though the anger in her eyes betrayed her. "I offer the warmth of my blood to your winter." She was using the sanitized vows, the political ones. Preston did not take her hand. He stood perfectly still, his massive chest rising and falling slowly. The silence stretched, becoming agonizing, then dangerous. The visiting alphas shifted uneasily in their seats. A king refusing Aluna's hand at the rehearsal was an insult that could start a war. "Your Majesty?" the High Elder prompted nervously. Stepping forward, Preston's golden eyes slowly lifted from Vespera's extended hand. He looked out over the sea of faces, past the highborn lords, past the furious elders. His gaze swept the shadows at the back of the hall, tracking like a predator until it locked onto the small, trembling figure hiding behind the stone pillar. "The silk," Preston rumbled, his voice low, yet carrying perfectly to every corner of the dead silent hall. He finally looked down at Vespera, his expression carved from ice. "Was not meant for you." Vespera's face drained of color. "Preston," she hissed, dropping formalities. A terrifying, earth-shaking growl tore from Preston's throat, a sound so purely alpha that several lesser wolves in the hall involuntarily dropped to their knees. "You do not wear her colors," he snarled, stepping past the shocked Lady Vespera, descending the steps of the dais. The crowd parted before him like water. He moved with terrifying, singular purpose, his golden eyes glowing in the dim light, fixed entirely on Sarah. Panic seized her. The entire keep was staring at her. The elders looked murderous. The scent of confusion and anger was suffocating. Her Omega instincts screamed at her to flee the overwhelming pressure of 100 alpha stares. Before Preston could reach the halfway point of the hall, Sarah turned on her heel and bolted toward the heavy oak doors that led out into the freezing night. The heavy oak doors of Blackwood Keep groaned shut behind Sarah, cutting off the suffocating heat and the shocked gasps of the gathered lichens. The shock of the sub-zero air hit her lungs like a physical blow, snapping her into survival mode. She didn't stop to grab a cloak. She didn't look back. She plunged headfirst into the swirling, unrelenting snowstorm. Her plain gray dress immediately soaked through at the hem as she broke into a terrified run. "What have I done?" The thought repeated in her mind like a frantic drumbeat. To be singled out by the Alpha King during the most sacred rehearsal of the pack's history was a death sentence for an Omega. The council would tear her apart for the humiliation of Lady Vespera. The other packs would demand her head for the insult. She scrambled down the icy stone steps of the courtyard, her thin shoes slipping treacherously. Behind her, a massive, booming sound echoed off the stone walls. It was the sound of the keep's doors being thrown open with such violent force they cracked against the masonry. Then came the roar. It was not a human shout. It was the terrifying, earth-shattering howl of the Alpha King. The sound vibrated through the falling snow, rattling the very bones in Sarah's body. It was a sound of absolute, possessive fury. He was hunting. Panic loaned her speed she didn't know she possessed. She sprinted past the blacksmith's forge, past the stables where the horses whinnied in sudden, primal terror, and made for the tree line of the whispering woods. The darkness there was absolute, a labyrinth of shadows that might just hide her from the wrath of the pack. She plunged into the deep drifts, fighting through the thick brush. The cold was beginning to numb her extremities, but the adrenaline rushing through her veins burned hotter than a forge fire. She ran until her chest heaved, until the icy air tasted like copper on her tongue. A sudden, immense weight hit the earth behind her, a thud so heavy it shook the snow from the pine branches above. Sarah scrambled around a massive oak tree, pressing her back against the rough bark, her breath coming in short, terrified gasps. The silence of the woods returned, but it was a loaded, predatory silence. "Sarah," the voice came from the darkness directly in front of her. It wasn't the gravelly baritone of Preston the King. It was deeper, more feral, vibrating with the raw edge of a man barely holding onto his human form. She squeezed her eyes shut, wrapping her arms tightly around herself as she began to shiver violently. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Please let me go. I will leave the territory. I will vanish. They will forgive you if I am gone." A low, dark chuckle resonated through the frozen air. Footsteps crunched slowly, deliberately in the snow, closing the distance. "They?" Preston murmured, his massive form emerging from the shadows. He had shed his ceremonial tunic. He stood in the freezing storm wearing only his trousers, the heat rolling off his bare, scarred chest in visible waves of steam. His golden eyes were fully luminous, the pupils blown wide to swallow the night. "You think I care about the forgiveness of the council? Or the fragile pride of the southern packs?" He stepped flush against her, trapping her small frame between the unyielding bark of the oak tree and the furnace of his body. The sheer proximity sent a jolt of pure, blinding heat straight to her core, melting the frost that had begun to settle on her skin. Sarah opened her eyes, looking up into his fierce, devastatingly beautiful face. "You humiliated a high-born alpha," she breathed, tears of sheer overwhelm spilling onto her frozen cheeks. "I am an Omega. The law. To hell with the law." Preston snarled softly, lifting his large, calloused hands to frame her face. His thumbs wiped away her tears, the touch infinitely gentle despite the lethal strength in his fingers. "The law did not calm my wolf when I took the throne. The law did not warm my bed. The law did not weave silver thread into midnight silk." He leaned down, burying his face into the crook of her neck. He inhaled sharply, drawing her scent deep into his lungs, a sound of profound relief rumbling in his chest. "I smelled you the day you arrived at the keep," he confessed, his lips brushing against her pulse point, sending a violent shiver down her spine. "I thought I was losing my mind. An Omega, but my wolf knew. The ancestors knew." "Preston," she whimpered, the absolute truth of his words echoing in her own soul. The mate bond finally snapping fully into place. A golden, unbreakable tether between their hearts. "Say it," he commanded, pulling back just enough to look deeply into her hazel eyes. The golden rings in his irises pulsed with an ancient, demanding light. "Say the words you read in the archives. Claim me, Sarah." She stared at him, the fear finally, utterly dissolving, replaced by a surge of fierce, undeniable love. She lifted her trembling hands, burying her cold fingers into the thick, dark hair at the nape of his neck. "I claim you," she whispered into the falling snow, the words rising like a prayer. "Not as possession, but as my own soul, walking outside my body." A ragged gasp tore from Preston's throat. His mouth crashed down onto hers, swallowing the rest of her words. The kiss was desperate, consuming, a collision of frost and firelight. His hands slid from her face to grip her waist, lifting her effortlessly into his arms so her feet left the snow. She clung to him, opening to him, the taste of cedar and ozone completely overriding her senses. As he deepened the kiss, his teeth grazed the sensitive skin of her lower lip, pulling a soft moan from her throat. He shifted his grip, his mouth trailing a line of molten fire down her jaw, settling over the soft curve of her neck. "Mine," he growled against her skin, right over the racing pulse of her mating gland. Sarah threw her head back, offering herself entirely, the Omega within her finally finding her true home. "Yours," she gasped. Preston bit down. The pain was a fleeting, sharp pinch, instantly swallowed by a blinding, euphoric rush of golden heat that exploded through her veins. The mark of the Alpha King seared into her skin, anchoring her soul to his, binding them in a way no council decree could ever undo. She clung to his broad shoulders as the world spun, anchored only by the immense, unwavering strength of the wolf holding her against the storm. The heavy doors of the great hall were still wide open, letting the bitter storm spill onto the polished marble floors. When Preston returned, the absolute silence inside the hall was deafening. The gathered alphas, betas, and elders had not moved. They stood frozen, their eyes locked on the archway. Preston walked into the light. He carried Sarah in his arms, her face tucked securely into the crook of his neck. He had wrapped her in his own thick fur mantle, shielding her from the cold, but her left shoulder was exposed just enough to reveal the fresh, bleeding mark of an alpha's bite. The scent in the room violently shifted. The mingling of rain, earth, Cedar and ozone, the undeniable biological signature of a mated pair, hit the crowd like a shockwave. Lady Vespera, still wearing the ill-fitting midnight blue silk, let out a choked sound of sheer outrage. "An Omega?" she shrieked, her violet eyes wide with disbelief and fury. "You reject the bloodline of the South for a scullery maid?" The High Elder stepped forward, leaning heavily on his cane, his scarred face twisted in anger. "Your Majesty, this is an abomination. The ancient laws explicitly forbid an Omega from taking the high seat. She cannot rule. She cannot be Luna." Preston stopped at the base of the dais. He slowly, gently set Sarah down on her feet. She swayed slightly, the adrenaline and the euphoric haze of the new bond making her dizzy. But Preston kept one massive arm wrapped securely around her waist, anchoring her to his side. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He let the full, terrifying weight of his alpha aura expand, a crushing physical pressure that forced the air out of the room. Several of the visiting lords took an involuntary step back, their own wolves whining in submission. "The laws you speak of were written by frightened, weak men who sought to control what they could not understand." Preston's voice rumbled, dark and lethal, vibrating against the stone walls. "The true law of our kind is the bond, the choice of the soul." He turned his blazing, gold-flecked eyes to the High Elder. "I did not choose a scullery maid, Elder. I found my equal. I found the only woman in this realm whose heart is strong enough to weather my winter. She is your true Luna. I will not bow to an Omega." Vespera snarled, her claws extending as she took a threatening step forward. Preston's arm tightened around Sarah's waist, pulling her flush against his side. The warning growl that ripped from his chest was so deep, so purely monstrous, that Vespera froze in her tracks, the color draining entirely from her face. "You are a guest in my hall, Lady Vespera," Preston said, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "You will speak to my mate with the respect her crown commands, or you will not leave this. Keep with your life. Do you understand me?" The threat hung in the air, absolute and uncompromising. Vespera stared into the eyes of the Alpha King, searching for a bluff, but found only the cold, unyielding promise of violence. Slowly, her claws retracted. She swallowed hard, averting her eyes in a universal sign of submission. Preston turned his gaze back to the gathered crowd. "If there is any Alpha here who wishes to challenge my claim, let him step forward now and face me in single combat." Silence reigned. The only sound was the crackle of the hearths and the howling of the wind outside. Not a single wolf moved. Sarah looked up at Preston, her heart swelling with an emotion so vast she thought it might break her ribs. He was risking his throne, his alliances, his entire kingdom for her. She reached out, her small, cold hand slipping into his massive, calloused one. She squeezed it gently. Preston looked down at her, the lethal, terrifying aura instantly melting from his features, replaced by a softness that only she would ever see. He brought her knuckles to his lips, pressing a kiss to her skin in front of the entire assembly. "Kale," Preston called out, his eyes never leaving Sarah's. The stoic Beta stepped forward from the shadows, his face devoid of surprise, as if he had known the truth all along. "Yes, Alpha, prepare the frost lilies," the king commanded, a slight, genuine smile finally touching the corners of his mouth. "My Luna's ceremony will commence at midnight." The great hall was bathed in silver. The thousands of heavy beeswax candles had been extinguished, replaced by the ethereal, luminescent blue glow of the frost lilies. The delicate flowers had been woven into massive, arching garlands that climbed the stone pillars and draped across the vaulted ceiling, casting the room in the gentle light of a winter dream. Sarah stood at the heavy oak doors, her breath catching in her throat. She was no longer wearing her plain gray wool. She wore the gown she had designed. The midnight blue silk flowed around her like water, the silver threads catching the faint light of the lilies, making her look as though she had been spun directly from the night sky. The silver ribbon, the first token he had ever given her, remained securely tied around her wrist. At the end of the long aisle, standing before the dais, was Preston. He wore the formal robes of the Alpha King, dark fur over black velvet, a silver crown resting atop his dark hair. But as the heavy doors opened and he laid eyes on her, the regal king vanished. He was simply a man, completely and utterly undone by the woman walking toward him. The gathered pack lined the aisle. The anger and shock from earlier had dissolved into an awed, reverent silence. As Sarah passed them, the heavy scent of an omega, usually soft, yielding, and maternal, was now laced with the sharp, crackling power of the Alpha King's mark. It was a scent that commanded absolute loyalty. Slowly, one by one, the proud lords and elders bowed their heads, baring their throats as she walked by. They were not submitting to fear. They were submitting to the undeniable, ancient magic of a true mate bond. Sarah reached the end of the aisle. Preston did not wait for her to step up to the dais. He stepped down, closing the final distance between them. He took both of her hands in his golden eyes shining with unshed emotion. "You are breathtaking," he whispered, his voice rough. "I designed it," she replied softly, a teasing, watery smile touching her lips. "I had a very specific vision." Preston chuckled, a deep, rumbling sound that warmed her to her toes. He turned to face the pack, but kept her hands securely in his. He did not look at the High Elder. He did not look at a scroll. He looked only at the woman standing before him. "I offer the warmth of my blood to your winter," Preston spoke, his voice carrying clearly over the hushed crowd, speaking the ancient vows Sarah had uncovered in the dusty archives. "I offer the shadow of my form to your blinding light." Sarah felt a tear slip down her cheek, glowing silver in the light of the frost lilies. She squeezed his hands, her voice ringing out, clear and melodic. "My heart is the drum. Your breath is the rhythm. I bare my throat to your fangs, not in defeat, but in trust." Preston stepped closer, the heat of his body wrapping around her. "You are the shelter in the storm," he vowed, his golden eyes blazing. "You are the fire in the frost, flesh to flesh, soul to soul." They finished together, their voices weaving perfectly into one sound, "Until the earth reclaims our bones." Preston did not wait for the elder's blessing. He pulled Sarah against his chest, his large hands framing her face as he brought his mouth down upon hers. The kiss was gentle, profound, and deeply sacred. As their lips met, a sudden, brilliant pulse of blue light flared from the frost lilies, illuminating the great hall with the undeniable approval of the earth itself. The pack erupted into a deafening, joyous howl, the sound shaking the frosted glass of the high windows. The Alpha King had found his mate. The Omega had taken the crown. They ruled Blackwood. Keep not as sovereign and subject, but as equal halves of a singular soul. Preston's reign, once marked by a terrifying, icy stoicism, was tempered by the profound warmth and empathy of his Luna. Sarah, the Omega who had once hidden in the shadows of the scullery, became the fiercely beloved heart of the northern packs, proving that true strength lay not in bloodlines or dominance, but in the quiet endurance of love. The ancient laws were rewritten, the pack flourished in the harshest winters, and the keep was forever filled with the scent of cedar, rain, and blooming frost lilies. If you enjoyed this story of fated mates and defying tradition, please like, share, and subscribe for more cinematic like and romance.